The sea still hissed against the shore, carrying the smell of blood and pine sap. Seagulls circled low, their cries swallowed by the smoke of burning thatch. What had been a village that morning was now a graveyard of noise. Axes still clanging, shields split, horses screaming in their last breaths. The Vikings had come at dawn. They always came with the dawn, when mist made ghosts of men. Their ships rose from the fog like blackened teeth, biting into the coast. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, every man of the village was either dead, chained, or dying. But it was not the men the raiders truly wanted. It was what remained after the battle. The women. They stood among the ruins now, clutching children, faces streaked with soot. Some still wore the amulets of their slain husbands, runes of strength, now useless against iron. They watched the longships gather the spoils of war, and they waited, though none could say what for. The leader stepped forward, his mail stained dark, a raven crest painted across his helm. He spoke in a voice that sounded like the sea-breaking stones. "These are not spoils," he said, looking at the captives. "They are offerings." The younger warriors laughed. The older ones did not. They knew what came next. Among the Vikings, conquest was not complete with victory alone. It required humiliation, a ritual of domination, older than law, older than gods. The wives of defeated men were taken not just as captives, but as proof, living trophies to remind the dead that their honor had ended with their breath. They were lined up in the square where their husbands had once feasted. The chief tore down the banners of the slain, replacing them with carved poles wrapped in animal hide. The drums began, a low, pulsing rhythm that had nothing of celebration in it. This was not feasting. This was memory turned into punishment. One by one, the women were brought before the chief. Names were demanded, family lines recited, so their new masters could erase them properly. Those who resisted were struck down, not killed, but broken enough to serve. The young ones were claimed by the warband. The elders were given to the shipmen as reward for rowing through storm and arrow. The children were taken aside. If strong, they would be raised among the raiders. If weak, they would never see the sea again. All of it done beneath the open sky, as the gods looked on. When night came, the survivors were marched to the beach. There, among the wreckage of boats and bodies, a pyre was raised, not for the fallen, but for the conquered. For every woman taken, her husband's corpse was burned, his ashes thrown to the tide. A mark, the raiders said, so that even in Valhalla he would remember his defeat. The women knelt in silence, the fire painting their faces red. Some prayed to Thor, others to Christ. Faiths divided by blood, but united in desperation. The chief walked among them, choosing, discarding, commanding. His warriors cheered as if the world itself were being rewritten in flame. And in a way, it was, because the Vikings believed that women carried not just life, but legacy. To take a warrior's wife was to take his lineage, to absorb his strength, to steal his future. They called it kenning the bloodline, a ritual act meant to blend bloodlines into glory. To the victims, it was something far simpler, the end of everything they knew. One woman, her name lost to history, raised her head as the chief approached. Her eyes did not plead. "They will sing of you," she said, in a voice that cut through the chanting, "but they will not remember your sons." The chief hesitated, For a heartbeat, the sea went quiet. Then he laughed, a sound without joy, and took her all the same. By dawn, the beach was empty, except for ash and silence. The ships had vanished into the fog, their sails blotting out the sunrise. Behind them, the land smoked and smoldered, and in the fields where the bodies lay, the crows began their feast. In the sagas, this raid would be remembered as a victory. In truth, it was something far worse, a birth, because from these acts came a generation of half-blood children, neither slave nor free, carrying both vengeance and memory in their veins. And somewhere on that haunted coast, the wind still carries their names. The raid was over, yet the land still trembled. The smoke from the pyres drifted out to sea, carrying prayers and curses in equal measure. To the Vikings, this was victory. To the captives, it was a shadow that refused to lift. At dawn, the longships cut through the mist, their prows carved as dragons, their hulls heavy with spoils. Below the deck, the surviving women were bound together by rope and silence. Every creak of timber, every groan of the sea felt like a heartbeat they no longer owned. They were not taken merely as slaves. Among the Norse, such women were called sidewives, chosen by fate, marked to feed both gods and men. To possess one was to hold the luck of her dead husband, the strength of his spirit bound inside her. The warriors spoke of it with reverence, even as they prepared for cruelty. When the ships reached the fjord, the mountains swallowed the light. Villagers lined the cliffs to welcome them, chanting to Odin and the All-Mother Frigg. The captives were led ashore to the sound of horns and drums, music that celebrated blood more than triumph. At the center of the village stood the sacred post of the ravens. Bones and skulls hung from it, clattering softly in the wind. Here, the rite of binding began. The chief stood bare-chested in the cold, his skin painted with ash and runes. He raised a raven feather to the sky and declared that the spirits of the fallen must be appeased. For every warrior slain, a wife of the defeated would serve as the bridge between worlds. They called her the Blood Bride. She was bathed in seawater and wrapped in wolfskin. Elders sang verses older than scripture, invoking the gods to accept her body as ransom for her husband's soul. The first woman chosen was young, barely more than a girl. Her gaze found no mercy in the crowd. Only hunger and superstition stared back. As the drums deepened, the warriors drank mead and watched the ritual unfold. They believed that if the raven circled above the pyre and cried out, it meant the gods had accepted her sacrifice. If it did not, the ritual continued until dawn. No one dared to stop it. To the onlookers, this was justice. To the priests, it was necessity. To the women, it was the slow erasure of everything human. By nightfall, the fjord echoed with the sound of wings. The ravens came, as they always did, drawn by the scent of fire and fear. They perched on the bones above the altar and screamed into the wind. The crowd roared their approval. The chief lifted his arms and shouted that the gods had spoken. The captives knelt, trembling, not in awe, but in the knowledge that tomorrow the ritual would begin again. Yet amid that horror, something else was born. The women began to whisper to each other in secret. They remembered their ancestors' songs, the ones sung not to gods, but to the earth. Songs of memory, of endurance. They hummed them under their breath while they scrubbed blood from the stone floors, while they carried water to the hearths of their captors. Slowly, their silence became a form of defiance. The warriors could take their bodies, but not their names. And in those dark halls where the ravens roosted, stories began to take shape. Tales of wives who cursed their masters, of children born with eyes like winter, of vengeance disguised as prayer. The Vikings called it superstition, but some among them began to wake screaming from dreams of drowning, of women's voices echoing from the sea. It was said that the gods accept every offering, but they never promised to keep what they took. The snows came early that year. The fjord froze before the harvest, and the mountains became white tombs watching over the sea. The fires of summer raids had faded to embers, but what the Vikings had sown on foreign shores had begun to grow, far from their sight, yet bound to them by blood. Across the waters, in the conquered lands, children were being born, children whose eyes carried the pale blue of the north and the sorrow of the south. They were neither slaves nor free. They were proof, the living echoes of that night of ravens and fire. Among the Norse, they were called Skugbarn, Shadowborn. It was said they dreamed in two tongues and walked with two fates, one of steel, one of shame. To the mothers, they were hope. To the raiders, they were a reminder that victory could breed ghosts. The women who had survived the ritual were scattered through the settlements of their captors. They tended the fires, raised the half-blood children, and learned the new tongue with silence. But every winter they gathered in secret, under the guise of honoring Freya, the goddess of love and war. Their songs were no longer prayers. They were warnings. In the dark of the longhouse, they burned herbs from their homeland and told tales of the men they had lost. They taught their daughters to remember those names and to never bow their heads before the axe. The younger ones listened with wide eyes, hearing stories the Norse sagas would never dare to write. And slowly, something changed. The Vikings had believed they had taken their enemy's legacy. But legacy cannot be stolen. It only transforms. The Shadowborn children grew strong. They learned the sword and the song. By the age of 15, some joined the raids themselves, the proof of conquest now turning its blade backward. They fought like the sea, restless, merciless, without allegiance. In one skirmish near the Irish coast, a Viking captain fell to a youth whose eyes mirrored his own. When the man died, the boy said only, "Now, our debt is even." The old warriors whispered that the gods were displeased. Dreams of drowned wives plagued their sleep. The ravens began to circle the ships before they left the shore. A bad omen, they said, an omen that the sea no longer favored them. But still, they sailed, and the cycle continued. Victory, plunder, blood, and birth, until the day the omen became prophecy. On a cold morning, a storm rose without warning. It swallowed 3 ships whole. Men, gold, captives, all gone in a single breath. Those who survived said they heard voices in the wind, women singing beneath the waves. When the tide returned their bodies to shore, the gulls would not touch them. The skalds tried to turn it into poetry, but even their verses trembled. A curse, they said, had taken root, a curse not of magic, but of memory. the vengeance of those who had been turned into symbols. The elders began to forbid the old rites. The raven poles were taken down, the drums silenced, the rituals called unwise. But history has its own hunger, and the more they tried to bury it, the louder it whispered. Years passed. The half-bloods grew into their own clans, their own gods, their own stories. They took to the sea not as slaves, not as victims, but as something new, heirs to both fury and sorrow. Wherever they landed, they carried the same flame, a desire to prove that pain, once born, cannot be conquered. In the sagas that survive, the bards speak of the generation of wolves. They say these were the children of the vengeance, neither Viking nor vanquished, but the storm between them. They brought an end to the rituals of blood brides, not through mercy, but through the quiet power of becoming what their fathers feared most, equals. And on the nights when the northern lights flared red as fire, the old women said it was the souls of the taken, finally finding their way home. Winter had become endless. The sea froze and thawed without mercy, and the ravens no longer returned. The old ones said it was a sign that even the gods had grown tired of watching men repeat their wars. The new generation of warriors no longer sang to Odin. They sang to no one. They fought not for glory, but for the ghosts behind them. And among those ghosts were women who had once been slaves, then mothers, then legends. In a village that clung to the edge of a northern cliff, a single flame burned. It belonged to one of the last of the Shadowborn. Her name was Astrid. Though no one called her that anymore, she carried a scar across her cheek, a mark from a blade meant for someone else. She was neither Viking nor victim. She was memory given form. When the chieftains gathered for what they called the final raid, she walked among them in silence. Some whispered that she was an omen. Others said she was the goddess Hel, come to collect what was owed. At dawn, the ships set sail once more, cutting through black water toward a nameless shore. The drums beat slower this time. Every man felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders, the echo of those women who had prayed under the same stars. Centuries before, the battle that followed was brief and cruel. Arrows darkened the sky, shields splintered, and the tide turned red. When it ended, Astrid stood among the wreckage. She raised her father's sword and threw it into the sea. The waves swallowed it whole, and in that moment, the wind changed. The sea grew still. The ravens came back. The survivors said they saw something that day. A light under the water, flickering like a dying heart. They believed it was the gods reclaiming their curse, taking it back into the deep. But Astrid knew better. The curse had never belonged to the gods. It had belonged to the people who created it. And now, finally, they were ready to let it go. She walked to the shore as the snow began to fall, the last of her clan behind her. They knelt, pressed their hands into the cold earth, and swore the final oath of the North. To remember is to forgive nothing. Then they turned away from the sea. Behind them, the old world sank beneath the horizon. Ahead lay the uncertain dawn of a people no longer bound by blood or vengeance, only by memory. Generations later, travelers still found runes carved into that cliff. They told of warriors who came to understand that victory is hollow when bought with the soul of the world. They told of women whose silence changed empires. They told of a sea that once ran red, and of how it learned, at last, to be blue again. And when the northern lights flare red across the sky, the elders still whisper, "Those are the souls of the lost," no longer crying, only watching. The story ends there, where ice meets fire, and the wind still carries the sound of distant drums. The Vikings are gone, but the memory of what they did, and what they learned too late, still walks with the waves.